throughout the month of May, CHSA is hosting programs and dedicating its activities supporting Chinese American voices. In the midst of anti-Asian violence, we not only want to condemn racial discrimination and hate, but we also want to educate through offering programs such as Celestials. Celebrating and amplifying the voices of Chinese and Asian Americans is vital for stopping anti-Asian hate. We hope that you take the time to learn today and share what you have learned with others so that they know the rich history of Asian Americans. It is now my pleasure to introduce the producer of Celestials, Barry Fong. He is a fourth-generation Chinese American and San Francisco native. Barry's activities as a filmmaker and community activist is an embodiment of his grandfather's dream of preserving his own experience as a turn-of-the-century Chinese immigrant. He previously served as the president of the board of directors for the Chinese Historical Society of America and directs Diversity and Governance, an organization that champions diversity, inclusion, and equity in nonprofit organizations. He has produced and directed short films about the Asian American experience. Thank you and welcome, Barry.
Thank you so much, Maggie. What a great introduction. And thank you for thanking all of our participants. It's not possible without any of you, without all of you. One of the great things about Zoom is that, we can all do this from home and we're comfortable and safe. But one of the hard things as a filmmaker is not being able to meet the audience and see the audience. So if you would, I actually want to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you, because I know we have people in Hong Kong, I'm in Hawaii, and people all across the United States today. So if you take a second to go into the chat and tell me where you're from, that'd be very fun for us. Celestials is the culmination of 6 years of work with the Stanford University's Chinese Railroad Worker Project, Railroad Workers of North America project. I worked on several different facets, one being the archaeology done in Kaiping, China, that connects early Chinese immigrants to the United States and to railroad workers. The second being a project I did with Connie Young, which was interviewing dozens of railroad worker descendants all across the country. And the third being the Chinese Historical Society of America's project, which was documenting the life of Phil Choi, who was an architect and a historian who fought for his entire life to try to get Chinese recognized as part of American history, the contributions as part of American history and of the development of the West.
Thank you for staying around for part 2. So we hope you all enjoyed the film. And now we're going to do the panelist discussion. But before we start, I'm going to introduce our panelists who are joining us. So Dr. Barbara L. Voss is a historical archaeologist and associate professor of anthropology at Stanford University. They've served as the director of archaeology for the Chinese railroad workers and the North American project at Stanford University. Their research program includes a long-term study of San Jose's historic Chinatowns, as well as research on home villages of Chinese migrants in Guangzhou, China. Also joining us is Connie Young. Connie is an independent historian and activist who has written about Asian Americans for over 50 years. She is motivated by her ancestors' struggles against exclusion and racism. She's the author of the book Chinatown, San Jose, USA, and the documentary Digging to Chinatown. Her maternal great-grandfather was a worker of the Transcontinental Railroad, and she's the co-editor of Voices from the Railroad, Stories of Descendants of Chinese Railroad Workers. Welcome, Connie and Barbara, and I'm going to turn the show over to Barry.
Thank you so much, Maggie. I'll introduce myself again for those of you who joined late. My name is Barry Fong. I am the director of the film and was involved in the Stanford Chinese Railroad project in a bunch of different ways, along with Barbara and Connie. A little bit of background, actually, my own grandfather was born about 2 miles away from Chengdu village. So I have a personal stake and personal interest in this project. He did not work on the railroad, but he is from that area, and that's where I'm from too. So I'll start by asking a very basic question first to Barb, because she appears first in the film. Maybe you can describe for the audience what your role was in the project.
Sure, absolutely. And Barry, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel today. And this is the first time I've seen the full film, and it was just really exciting to see all of your hard work and careful, painstaking documentary efforts come together. So thank you very much for the great work you're doing. So as was mentioned, I'm a professor of archaeology at Stanford University, and my role on the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project was as the director of archaeology. And in that capacity, I really did two things. One of them is that I organized and coordinated a network of over 100 archaeologists working throughout the North American West, all of whom in one way or another had been doing research on Chinese railroad worker sites or other themes related to Chinese railroad workers. And we worked together to try to build a comprehensive understanding of the material conditions of Chinese railroad workers' daily lives as they move throughout the U.S. West, working on different railroad projects throughout the U.S. West. The second role, which was featured in the film, was developing the Chengdu Village project.
Right here. No, where
Thank you. Sorry about that. I just didn't want to shout over it. So what was featured in the film was the Chengdu Village project in Kaiping County in Guangdong Province. And thanks to our co-director, Celia Tan, who is from Wuyi University in Guangdong Province, we were invited to partner with her to develop an archaeology project of a Chinese railroad workers' home village. And this was really important. One of the biggest challenges we had in our research in the United States was that while we have a very, very strong body of evidence of the daily lives of Chinese railroad workers here in the US, we didn't know how to compare that against what their lives had been like in China prior to coming to the United States. And so that's the other role I played, was co-directing that project with Dr. Tan, and trying to get the research going on both sides of the Pacific.
Excellent. So Connie, I'm going to give you a little help pre-introduction because I think you'll be very modest, but Connie was my partner in interviewing. I think we interviewed about 60 descendants over those years, and also the writer and producer of the Phil Choi film, and obviously the speaker at the Spike 150. Momentous moment. So maybe you can talk a little more about how you see your role.
Well, thanks very much, Barry. It was great. You know, we were partners in all of this, and I think it was something, we were doing something that had never been done before. Because I've, of course, being an independent historian means that I talk to people, I talk to descendants, I talk to people who live through history, and I'm not going through any texts or you know, or past research by other people. I'm talking to people and descendants and about like Angel Island immigration, and that's more recent. But when Gordon Chang and Shelley Fishkin called me to their office, it was, I guess, the fall of 2012, and said, well, we have this project. We'd like you to interview descendants of Chinese railroad workers. And I thought, oh my goodness, it's like, we're talking about, well, 5, 6 generations, you know, past, and we're talking about, you know, getting in their experience and what it was like to build the railroad. But I thought, you know, it's possible, because we're going to learn about how the workers were able to have descendants, how they took root. So what Gordon said was very reassuring. He said, we may not find much, but we will find something, and we will certainly hear good stories. And that is absolutely true. And that was a big surprise to me, because of certain people actually having evidence. I mean, that's amazing. Of, like, you know, equipment tag from Mark Jupiter, you know, from the Central Pacific. That was Montgomery Holmes. And then, of course, the gold watch given to Mok Chuk by, you know, Central Pacific, you know, bigwig. And, you know, it's in the possession of a descendant, you know, Vicky Tom. Vicky
Yeah,
Tom
that,
Young.
that actually leads me right into the next question, Connie. What did you, before we even ever interviewed a single descendant, what did you expect to find? What did you hope to find?
I hope to find some kind of evidence of the story. You know, I didn't expect really artifacts because, you know, what are they going to do with a tool or something? But I hope to find a paper trail, and we did. We found names of railroad workers. You know, the ancestors of some of the descendants. Their names on the you know, like Jim King, and we found out that he had, his other name was Zhao Qi, and his descendant, you know, the great grandson, Jean Chan, just took out the certificate of residence and said, oh, this is my great grandfather's. And there's a picture of a railroad worker, the former railroad worker. That was, to me, one of the most exciting things. And that's what I wanted to find. I mean, a photograph would be fantastic, and we did. So that's one of the things. And
on to Barb.
You're the one who said, I don't think he knows what he has. And you said, may I scan this, please?
That's right. He didn't know. It was just something in a shoebox for him, but it was something we'd been looking for months already. And so on to Barb. You know, because I have a junior archaeology badge now after spending several years with you. I realized, you know, it's a detective business is really what it is. And so what did you, while you were at home in Palo Alto, before we ever set foot in China, what did you hope to find?
Well, what I hoped to find was...
Oh, that was for Barb. Connie.
That's okay. Connie,
Yeah.
Connie was on the
Palo Alto.
No, please go ahead.
No, I was thinking what you're doing is connecting the dots for us, connecting the two countries. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I think Connie said it exactly. We knew what, I mean, and I want to back up and say there's a lot of different kinds of archaeology. When people think about archaeology, they often think about pyramids or temples. They think about, you know, very, very, very old things. The kind of archaeologist that I am is someone who studies everyday people who are often overlooked by history. And we do that by studying the very small things that are left behind. Really, you know, what they've discarded in the course of their daily life. We can put together clues about the rhythms of their day, what they ate, where they slept, how they gathered, whether they were, you know, what they worshipped, if they worshipped, how they treated their bodies medicinally, all these kinds of questions. And you know, so we had a lot of information about that from the United States, and we did not have any information about that from home villages in southern China. My greatest hope was actually what came to be, which is that we found what we call domestic deposits. These are deposits of household refuse or objects that were from the same period as the time that the railroad workers and later Chinese immigrants were working in the United States during the 19th century. And what that allowed us to do for the first time is do that one-to-one comparison of examining what was going on in the home community, what was going on in the work camps and in the Chinatowns and other kinds of settlements. And it has really completely expanded our view of our understanding of how to interpret the artifacts we find in the US. So that was my hope. We had no idea. I mean, I think you get a sense of it from Barry's film that not only, you know, this was the first project of its kind, but also many of the archaeologists involved had never worked in China before. And so we really didn't know what to expect. We had a lot of hopes, and it went beyond anything we could have possibly hoped for. I mean, incredibly successful, largely due to the cooperation and support of the local village residents whose oral history really guided us to where we should dig, what we should be looking for. And then, of course, our collaborators at Wu Yi University.
Yeah, I should also mention that none of this was possible without a huge team of people. And I think a few of them are in the audience. I see Deb Kohler's here. I see Laura Ng here. I see Sue Lee, Chelsea Rose, and sorry, I can't see everybody at once, but thanks to you all. And I hope you all chime in via chat if you have anything to add or any answers to questions that get posed later. So I realized in the Chengdu film that it all looks very easy and neat and tidy, and maybe even compressed into a small amount of time. But my son was in 8th grade when we started, and he was a freshman in college when we finished. There was a lot of time that happened in between, and compressed into this 25 minutes of film. So, Barre, maybe you can tell us first about the challenges, the low points, the hard days. I know there were certainly a lot of logistical challenges.
Well, I think every archaeology project is as much a logistical project as it is a research project, because you have to mobilize people and materials and supplies. Again, I feel that we were very, very lucky to have incredible support from the village residents, as well as from our co-investigators, translators, government officials. All kinds of people came together to make this happen. And I think that that's a really critical part of this to know, is that home village studies is a really big part of academic research in southern China. The Wuyi University has the Chinese Hometown Village Studies Center. So there's already a really strong infrastructure for supporting this kind of research. There had not yet at that point been archaeology. And so that was the biggest challenge, was how do we craft a kind of US style historical archaeology project in a very, very different setting. One of the first things we learned was that what we in the United States call historical archaeology, Chinese scholars refer to as folklore studies. The 19th century to them is not really considered archaeological in the same way that in the United States we treat it that way, but that doesn't mean it's not studied. And so we had an initial series of conversations, and Barry and Connie, you were both on some of those trips, of just having conversations about, us learning about the scholarship that was already being done, and also presenting what we have been doing with archaeology in the United States to start defining a framework for collaboration. And I think the interdisciplinary component of this is really critical, because there's a feeling that every piece of the puzzle contributes something. And for me, it was really gratifying to see the archaeology alongside the oral history and the commemorative work all together in this film, because again, I think that shows the big picture. One of the biggest challenges we had was in getting an excavation permit. And the reason simply was that there wasn't a process for getting an excavation permit for excavating a 19th century deposit. It was outside, there wasn't a category for it in the application process. And eventually, working with the government agency, the universities, we ended up coming up with a pathway forward that allowed us to go ahead with the excavations. And I'm really glad that worked out, because the results were absolutely amazing. And we could talk a lot about that, but I'll stop there. Thanks.
Connie, so we did a lot of legwork, chasing down Descendants and traveling to talk to them and hit some dead ends. Maybe you can talk about what you see as the challenges of that part of the project.
Well, before I talk about the challenges there, I want to say one triumph, and this was in June, after our 150th. I went to Wuyi University. I was part of the Stanford group. We were giving our presentation, and then we went to Candong Village, and seeing of course the familiar village-looking buildings, and on the front of one of the buildings, tacked onto the wall, is a poster that's sort of like in the style of the Great Event poster, but it's in Chinese, and it says 10 miles in one day. And I was so moved, 10 miles in English and Chinese, 10 miles in one day. And it really just shows that there was this pride, this sense of incredible pride in the people and the accomplishment, and wanting to be part of it, because I heard there was a 10-mile bike race, in that commemoration. So what do you think? I mean, that's pretty exciting.
Yeah.
I think the challenges are making people, the American people realize that we're not just talking about, our history or, trying to get back to reclaim history. We're connecting history, and we're also trying to explain what this immigration did to the American soul, the American spirit, because, we're talking, we see every day in the paper, anti-Asian hate and all these incidents, and specifically, anti-Chinese and anti-China. So where did this all come from? And it must go back to that huge influx of Chinese labor in the 1860s that suddenly, you know, they were used. I mean, they were called the indispensable enemy. You know, they were great, terrific labor force, but when the railroads finished, you know, it's time for them to go home. Like, and then the early exclusion laws, the earliest immigration laws were anti-Chinese, to keep the Chinese out, to make them extinct from America. And so these are the deep roots of the racism in America. The idea of keeping America white, keep the nativist attitude that, you know, that the Chinese must go and Asians must go. So, you know, we struggle with that, and that the history is important, the evidence is important, all the things that that community people are doing. But the community people, and I've heard them, so many of their speeches, they keep making this connection with the Chinese exclusion law and the World War II Japanese American relocation camps. They're talking about this, and they're saying this is very deep and it's in our history. We have to deal with it. We have to face it, move forward.
Excellent. Let's connect that with Connie with your speech at Spike 150 and what that moment felt for you. I mean, you're a descendant of a railroad worker. It was your mom's passion. Really, she had, you know, she created a lot of your career by saving all this material, right? Over time, over decades. So maybe you can talk about what it was like to walk into that stage. I'll paint the picture because I expected that there would be 300 people at this event, and there must have been 15,000 people packed into an area meant for 500 people. And I kind of walked in there casually, and I ended up shoulder to shoulder with, you know, 100 other camera people. And so tell me about that moment, and tell me, did you feel a sense of vindication for your family's history?
Well, I'll just tell you about the preparation for it. You know, I still had that paranoia. I just said, I was driving to Promontory with my brother, and we're in this car, and then we see this line of cars going up. I mean, there were 20,000 people, some people, and then we're in this line of cars, and I thought, well, maybe I'll be too late, but maybe I won't even be on the program. Maybe they're going to say, sorry, Monsieur, there's no time for you, you know. So I had that parent, but I had on my mother's dress and the jade she gave me, and it was a dress that she had made that year of, you know, because she got all quite a wardrobe to go to Promontory for the 100th, you know, and she saved all that, and I felt that, you know, I had to do this, you know, and it wasn't for my family, it was for the Chinese Historical Society, but it was for America. It was just like what Phil Choi did. He said, I'm not doing this just for the Chinese, it's for American society, it's for American people. So anyway, it got closer and closer, and I was on time, and Max Chang, who was on the committee, the only Chinese on the committee, you know, had guided me through and said, okay, we're ready for you. And guess what? There's going to be a lion dance. And I go, a lion dance, that's so Chinese. I said, I think we're on the program. And what really solidified it for me was they were passing out these flyers, everybody, like 20,000 copies. They were like the small great event poster, you know, with the schedule. And then on the back, they had a schedule of speakers. The first one is commencement, Connie Young, Chinese Historical Society of America. And I thought, I'm on, it's going to work. I felt a lot of people, you know, were pulling for me. And when I, you know how I talk, I you know, look at the asides and the halts and everything. But when I gave that speech, it all came out, and somebody said, your ancestors were helping you. I really felt
I love that. I love it. So Barb, I know archaeology happens kind of in a slow motion. That's not an insult. It's an art. It takes time. So, but was there like a eureka moment for you? Was there a moment where you felt like, you know, it was the peak, or did it happen in China? Was it back when you're in the lab back at home?
You know, there were a lot of eureka moments. I think the first one was actually the first day I visited Chengdu village as part of the tour, the conference tour with Dr. Tan, and you and Connie were there. And you know, she grabbed me by the wrist and she said, "You have to come see this." And this is where she and her architectural historian teams were reconstructing this village temple. And she started putting ceramics in my hand, and they were exactly like the ones that we have found in the United States at Chinatown sites, at Chinese railroad worker sites. And I knew in that moment that there was, that we could see the material connection, you know. And I think that I've heard this from other archaeologists who have visited Chengdu village during our project or have seen our thing, that moment of recognition where we get to, it sounds kind of, I don't know how to put it otherwise, but we get to experience the artifacts in their home environment, you know, and where they were, you know, near where they were made, where the communities that used them were from. And it's hard to explain how that has radically changed my own understanding of what we are interpreting. So that was definitely an aha. That was the earliest and the first aha moment. I think that the other aha moment, one of our biggest questions, this comes up in the film, we find a lot of European and United States manufactured goods on Chinese railroad worker sites. We also find a lot of European and American manufactured goods on all 19th century sites in the US. I mean, this is what was around. The question we had was this new material for immigrants coming from Europe and from China and everywhere else, or is this material that was already familiar to people? And I think that the thing that really struck me, you know, the film talks about the Abiatine medicine bottle. And that I think is a particularly interesting artifact because it's a Western produced artifact that has not been found in the United States before. But there was so much other things. I mean, you know, British and US produced ceramics, other kinds of medicine bottles from Boston, from New York, from Chicago, clothing artifacts, right? Buttons and buckles from Western style clothing, arms and armaments, you know, British and French gun flints, grooming products. We found a lot of hair tonic and shoe polish, things like that. Also some foodstuffs. To me, what I think is so interesting about that is that it really shows how interconnected Southern China already was with the world prior to mass outmigration. And this interchange between, you know, the Americas and Europe and Asia was already well underway for hundreds of years, and not just among elites, not just in the cities, but also in, you know, what are seen as rural villages. These were not isolated communities. And we know that the goods were flowing in the other direction. We know that both white and Chinese people in North America were using Chinese products, right? You know, Chinese made products. We did not know that it was going in the other direction. And I think that was just really, really exciting to see, and kind of helped us understand what the experience of home villagers were, that this, you know, that this is a cosmopolitan society that's very much engaged with the world. And that's not how Chinese railroad workers have been portrayed in a lot of mass media, you know, conversations about this. So that was I don't know if it's an aha moment, but it was definitely a process for us of really kind of changing the way we saw the 19th century world.
Yeah, that's great. And a great kind of a segue, because the next question was, you know, what were the biggest surprises? And I wanted to talk for a second about the biggest surprise to me, which was the architecture in China, and how clearly the influence from outside China affected these villages. So from the, if you look in the film, from these single-story gray brick traditional layout homes to then mansions that were, you know, with sort of Euro-Western influences that weren't quite accurate, but columns and decorations, and then to the towers, which actually you know, required technology that wasn't in China at the time. I think construction technology, reinforced concrete, and so that was a big surprise to me. And I think if you just glance at the village, you wouldn't notice that it's sort of dense looking. You had to slow down and spend some time there and look at and think about the time that passed, and and when those things were built and how they were built. It's fascinating, and hope the audience gets a chance to see it sometime. But Connie, was there through the process a big surprise for you?
Well, yes. I wanted to add to the buildings, the houses. A lot of the houses were built with money from railroad workers. Certainly my grandfather's, my great-grandfather's home in Sunjin. And when we first went to the conference in China, remember, we were given some time off to either go to the village or to go to look at some our artifacts. And I went to my village, and I walked into the library that was built next to the middle school, which also was funded by our relatives. And I saw my grandfather's picture there, you know, and he's a son of a railroad worker, you know, and it was very moving and it was because he had sent money back to build the home, the ancestral home. So, and they had these towers, remember, that were built by, of course, the Chinese themselves, but the money came from Gamsan, you know, the railroad village, the Zhou Titlo, the people who worked on the Iron Road. Okay, about a surprise. This is related, this is a story, and it's by Paulette Liang, and you picked up on it too. She was talking about how, you know, on one side of the family, it was railroad workers, and another side, they were merchants, and her great-grandfather's store was dynamited. And she said, you know, the Chinese in our families always sent money back to the village to build a home so they'd have a home to go to in case they were driven out. And I kind of listened to it, and you said, did you hear that? You know, and you said, that's the clue. And that was very early in our program. I think before you were, you knew you were going to be working in China on archaeology in the village.
Yes. Barb, was there a big surprise for you? You kind of touched on a few things already.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think, there's so many things. I think that, I mean, it's hard to describe, you know, as an archaeologist, it's hard to describe what it is like to have the opportunity to work with a group of, you know, collection of artifacts that has never, the kind of which has never been collected before. I think another surprise we had, I mean, I don't know if it was a surprise, but it was a question we had in the United States when we were working on Chinatowns and railroad worker camps and other kinds of sites like that. We find a very narrow range of porcelain dishes and ceramic storage dishes and things like that. And one of the things that we just didn't know is this what was available in the market in China, or was this kind of something else going on? And the variety of artifacts, of ceramics, of other kinds of artifacts that we found in the excavations at Chengdu village was orders of magnitude greater than what we find in the United States. And I think that one of the important things that helps us understand is that, you know, even in Chinatowns, even in Chinese railroad worker camps where people were getting supplies from China, they weren't necessarily getting the same goods that were used in their home village, right? They had a much narrower choice of objects. Sometimes it was different objects. And I mean, I'm struggling to put this into words, but I think a lot of the time I was working on this project, and still do, I was trying to do the impossible, which is put myself in the experience of someone who was leaving Kaiping and traveling through rivers to Hong Kong, and then by ship to the United States, and then by rail to Sacramento, and even further to work on the railroad. And I think that one of the things that I just remember feeling as we were working on this work is just incredible admiration for Chinese railroad workers' ability to absorb and adapt changes that were happening around them all the time. Because even once they arrived on the railroad, they were moving through hundreds of miles of Western landscape and different kinds of terrain, different kinds of weather, using different work techniques for different locations, engaging differently with the local environment. We see that in the archaeological evidence of railroad work camps, that people were buying goods from local farmers. They were hunting and fishing and gathering plants on the local landscape, wherever they went. And this capacity, this flexibility I think became really evident to us as we were also doing, as we were kind of going in the other direction and trying to understand the home village experience. So again, I'm sorry I'm not giving you like the one beautiful artifact, but it wasn't really like that. It was really more of getting a big picture understanding of all the aspects of people's daily lives and how that had been then transformed as they migrated to the United States and got caught up in different kinds of labor. And as Connie points out, also we're continuing to build lives in China at the same time. And so that kind of whole entirety is really the big thing that I took away from it.
This is how good you two are. You're answering the questions before I ask them. So my next question was about, how do you see, how does how does this research change the big picture of how you think of Chinese in America during that time period? So I'll let Connie give that a minute or two, and then it looks like we have a list of questions coming for us. So Maggie can get ready to do that.
Okay, well, I think that I've talked about how we're getting stories from Descendants, and I think that it has, the project has really set a process. This is how you write history. This is how you make history real. It's from stories from people, from Descendants, and connecting the dots with other research, with archaeology, with the paper trail of immigration, especially for Chinese. My goodness, we are so documented in paper, but the people part comes from talking to our community, talking to, if we're lucky, to talk to our grandparents and great-grandparents, possibly, and hearing stories that have been passed down.
Yeah, that's something I've encouraged every audience to do over the past couple of years, which is because cell phones are so good now, and if your parents are still around, your grandparents are still around, sit at the dining table, ask them a few questions about their childhood, about where they grew up, how they grew up, what they remember, and maybe have them talk about the big events that happened in their lives, because it's so much easier to do than it was 35 or 40 years ago, that we should all be doing it. And we see that all three of you, the three of us see that year by year, facts get smeared and blurred and lost. And so we should all be doing that. Thank you both so much for the little discussion, and I'll hand it over to Maggie for some questions from the audience.
Awesome, thank you so much. That was such a great discussion. We have a list of questions already set, and we do have more questions coming in, hopefully, so please send those to Kimberly. We're going to start off with a question for Barry about the documentary. We had a few people who are kind of asking, like, is it possible to purchase the DVD of the documentary? And maybe you want to just tell us some future plans for the film.
Yeah, so the film actually was finished way back in 2019, and I plan to use 2020 to promote it. And we all kind of know what happened there. So if you would like a DVD, we haven't pressed any yet, but if you send an email to celestialsmovie@gmail.com, I'll put you on a list, and I'll keep you updated with what's happening there. And I plan to submit the film to film festivals once they're back open, and hopefully get it on public TV eventually.
Awesome, and we will send out the email address in the chat, as well as a follow-up for everyone. I had another question. I think Connie, you might be able to answer this, but Barry as well. It's more of a historical question. But do any of you know what, like, when the term celestial starts to become used in history?
Well, I first saw it in the Golden Hills, a newspaper of the 1850s. The term was celestials. Some celestials are coming. I think the journalists preferred using it in the beginning rather than Chinamen, because that was a more common term. So they just sort of thought of an easier name, instead of saying Chinese people, just celestials. And it came from, of course, the Chinese talk about the Middle Kingdom, Zhongguo. So I guess celestials of that kingdom. Barry, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, so I think that, this is the first question that has come up every time I've previewed this footage. I think it was meant as an insult, right? I mean, China considered itself the kingdom of heaven and the center of all things. And I think for Westerners, they'd see these tiny people probably wearing not so fancy clothing and say, oh, look at these celestials. They think they're something, but they're just little runts. But it turns out that the Chinese that helped build the Transcontinental Railroad did something that was quite celestial. And in an example of that is the San Francisco Ferry Terminal. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but it at one point in the 1930s was the second busiest transit terminal in the world. And that's because the train terminated in Oakland and Sacramento, and that was the main way to get across the bridge. So without the transcontinental, the development of the West would not be what it is, that would not have happened the way it did. And so my feeling is I'm trying to show that we're taking this name back. They did do something that was epic and godlike to forge the path across the Sierras and to weather the hardships and the deaths and continue on.
Oh, it's a great name for the title, and I think it's a great way to kind of explain the term a little bit more. Because I hadn't ever heard of that until I saw the documentary. Thank you. Our next question is, we're going to have an audience member ask it live, and it's from Scott.
Hi, this is Scott. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, Scott.
Hey, Barry. This is Scott Lotus from the Center for Velvet Photography and Art. Just fantastic presentation today, and we're just delighted to be a part of it. And hats off to you and everyone involved here. And having seen now, this is, I think, the fourth iteration of the film now that I've seen as from all of our events in 2019, and it's just wonderful to see all of the additional material that you've brought in. And I'd love to just know some of your insights as a storyteller as to how you took all these different threads and wove them together into this wonderful kind of cohesive narrative.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you for attending and having your membership attend today. The answer is a lot of time. And I really think I shot probably 150 hours of footage in China, and so that all just sort of sat in my head, and all those probably 50 plus interviews of Descendants, and all that sort of sat in my head and stewed. And I tried actually really for a couple of years to try to put it together into a narrative, and it really wasn't until the Spike 150 happened, and I saw Connie up there, and I thought, okay, this struggle has an end. This story has a little bit of an end, even though I think the struggle continues, but at least this part of the story has a finish that we can show. And so it was the perfect bookend for all the work that had happened 6 years prior.
Thank you so much, Scott. Our next question comes from Wei Gan, and is for Barb, and they're going to ask it live.
Great. Hi everyone. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, and also for the film. It's fascinating. So to Professor Voss, I'm curious about this idea of the railroad village. And I know that Connie spoke about how ancestral homes were rebuilt with money sent back from the railroad workers. But I was wondering if in your excavations, you found evidence of other material artifacts, maybe, I don't know, luxury items that somebody might have sent back. Because I know, my mom used to take back deodorant all the time, every time we went back to China, So that's one part of my question. And the other part is, I don't know if I'm understanding the history accurately, but were there railroad workers who went back to China to marry, have children, and came back to the US? And if so, did you find evidence of the wives and the families' daily lives?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for both of those questions. And I think that the first question, did we find evidence of luxury goods? There were, it's interesting you mentioned deodorant. A lot of the Western or US produced goods that we found were medicines and grooming products. And several people in the village suggested that that was seen as an appropriate gift to come back home with. So, shoe polish, cologne, face cream, and different kind of medicines, especially kind of a lot of just kind of general health tonic type medicines. And in fact, one woman explained to me that people would bring wherever they went, they would bring the local products back for people in the village to try, and particularly as gifts for honored elders, to kind of bring the travel back to the elders who had stayed in the village. And so we're not sure which goods were marketed in China and which goods were brought back as gifts. We are pretty sure that the Aviatine Medical Company was marketing directly to China. We found those bottles, specifically with Chinese labels, in at least one other village in that area in Taishan County. Laura Eng has found that as part of her dissertation research. So we suspect that that may have been marketed to Chinese people in China directly, but other goods were probably very much brought back as gifts, and also because people returning would have wanted to have things they were familiar with, that they enjoyed. So I think that you're understanding it exactly as we are, right? That there's this kind of bidirectional flow, and that does refer back to kind of who are we actually studying when we're studying the village. You're absolutely right. We know from village records and oral history that most able-bodied young teenagers and young men left the village at several points to go to different places to raise money and support their families and support the village, coming back at times to marry, have children, then go travel someplace else to work or go back to where they had been working. There's a story that several people told me about different, it was told in slightly different ways about a family with 4 sons, sometimes 5 sons, where each son would go to a different place around the world, right? The United States, Cuba, Australia, Singapore, and then one person would go to like Hong Kong, so they'd be nearby, right? And the hope was that one of them would do well, and then they could send for the other brothers or build a transnational business across different countries, that kind of thing. So when we're studying the people who are in the village, we're very much studying elders, we're studying adult women, and we're studying children. And and of course, there were some adult men who came back and visited, and some people who did stay in the village. But for the most part, that's the part of the family that we're able to study through those archaeological remains. And I think that that's another part of it. When we talk about Chinese railroad workers, we're talking largely about, teenagers and adult men. And there's a kind of masculinist aspect to that. Those workers were all supported by and connected with, very, very, very complex intergenerational families who were still remaining in the village and who were really still very much part of their social life. And so studying the village and the work camp together, it helps us put the whole family back together archaeologically.
Thank you. Kind of related to that question, and maybe this was already answered, but there was a question not just about like what happened, archaeology, or sorry, I have a hard time with that word in particular, but there were some questions about like, were there any interviews that were done with descendants of railroad workers? So kind of on the other side, work with a documentary. Any oral histories from descendants?
About women?
At the village in Canada.
In Chengdu Village, we focused a lot of our interviews on recent history with the villagers helping us identify where to excavate. In this part of China, these are clan-based villages. All the adult men have the same surname. The women who currently live in the village are women from other villages who married in that generation. And so there are genealogies and other written information about the male lineages in the village, but the women who are currently living in the village who we were able to interview and talk with were much more interested in talking about recent history, recent events that had occurred while they had been living there over the past 40 to 80 years. And so the oral history looks a little different in that context. Our colleagues at Wu Yi University have done really extensive oral history interviews. Those are primarily published in Chinese. And there's been a little bit of work that's been starting to be published in English. As part of our kind of a research agreement with them, our work was really focused on the archaeology because that's what we could bring to the team that they didn't already have capacity for at their university. And so we ourselves did not go out looking for railroad worker descendants to interview, although many of the people in the village we were in did talk about, oh yeah, I had an ancestor who was a railroad worker, and of course, people who helped build the first railroad in southern China, because people came back from the United States with technical knowledge and with entrepreneurial skills and energy, and we're also constructing some of the first railway networks in China right there as well. And so that was also a common topic of discussion.
Very cool. Yes,
I want to add that when I went there in 2019, in June, people were telling stories, just like you mentioned, Laura. I had a relative who went to China. I mean, from China went to Gumsan and came back. But one of the men who kept talking to me, and just because he heard that I came from Sunshine Village, he said his wife was from Sunshine Village, and he wanted to tell me more about the women that were left behind. And he said, here's a site where there was a temple that women would go to pray, just women. And I was very surprised. I had never heard of that before. They were praying to Kuan Yin and maybe other deities, and it was for the safe return of their husbands. So, and he also said there was one village close by in which all the men went to Cuba, and he said not a single one returned. That was in the 1890s, so, or maybe earlier. It was very moving just to hear people tell us stories like that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that we can learn from our history, but yeah, by going back to China and going back, to the origins. That's very fascinating to learn that. I have another question related to the oral histories. I think this is for both Barry and Connie. The question comes from Laura. She wanted to know if you could explain the process for locating and interviewing descendants, and how did you kind of choose these people, or who did you maybe not choose?
Well, the Stanford Chinese Railroad Project, developed a questionnaire and published it and had it online and said to send it out to all organizations, to the community. And the questionnaire was, to find out if you're a Chinese railroad worker's descendant of who is specifically the Transcontinental Railroad, and that if you would consent to be interviewed. And the first question, which I thought was really important, and this was one that I would ask first, and it was, what year did your first ancestor who came to America, what year was that? And if it was between the years of 1850 and 1869, there's a very possibility that person, we would interview that person, because it's certainly that their ancestor worked on the railroad, so.
Yeah, I think that's right. So Stanford certainly led us to the first group of people. The Chinese Historical Society of America led us to another group of people. And it was a little bit of a daisy chain where, some of our interviewees would lead us to other people that they knew. And we certainly did have to say no to some people. Someone's gonna open mic.
Sorry about that. Yeah, we turned on the mics. Yeah, we did turn on the mics, everyone, just so we could have people ask live, but just be careful not to accidentally turn on your microphone. Sorry, Barry.
Yeah, no problem. So what I noticed after probably the first 30 interviews, that some of these stories about railroad working started to repeat themselves. And so almost as if the legends were sort of passing between families. And I started to suspect that, a lot of these things did not happen to their own family, but happened to another family. And then the story got passed around. So we certainly said no to people who, as Connie said, whose ancestors were not in the country at the right time, but they felt like they had railroad worker roots. But as we talked to them, we realized that they, would not have been possible for them to have participated.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, to learn that kind of history that way. Very cool. Next question. Thank you. Sorry about that, everyone. We're up to the next question that I have listed. So if you do have more questions, please answer those. We do have more time to ask questions. Our next question right now comes from Steve, and he asked, did the Central Pacific use any Chinese names for their stations or geographic locations? We know, yeah, I don't know if anyone knows the answer to that.
They would be Chinese names. They'd be like China Gulch or China Station, or, you know. We haven't seen them, even though, you know, on the payroll, I mean, we see the names of Chinese foremen. They're usually on the payroll. Not all Chinese are listed that are workers, but we'd have, you know, usually they would be foremen or headmen or agents. But as far as, I haven't seen any, Barry. What have you, or Barb?
No, the closest thing I can think of is at Promontory, there's the Chinese Arch, right? Which is a rock formation that's close to the Promontory station. And I tried to look up the history of that, and it's very vague about when it was named.
And it was first called Chinaman's Arch. There was
Of course.
some Chinese activists said, can you just change it to Chinese Arch, you know, please? We like it having an arch, but we don't want that name.
Thank you. We have a comment that came in from Judy, and I'm going to read the whole thing just you guys. So there's been lots of comments and compliments coming in through the chat. So I hope you guys all get a chance to kind of go through that. Just, you know, lots of compliments about everyone's work. But Judy says, what an interesting approach to think that there are artifacts that exist through correlation back to native country, a mirror approach to verifying history. These stories that help us understand our own history are critical to how we can learn to live today in this land built on slavery and immigration of populations like the Chinese. The 100-year snubbing of the railroad workers was eye-opening. Mr. Choi was certainly not a failure, but a linchpin in this process. Thank you very much for this important and enlightening work. And the question is, what are future projects coming down the pike for Barre? I guess for all of you as well, what are some future projects you guys are working on?
I'm actually working on a different film about Vietnamese boat refugees that escaped Vietnam in 1984, spread out across the globe actually, and then managed to find the boat they rescued on in an art auction in Paris. And so they're undergoing an effort to recover this boat and bring it back to the United States. And they're all about, planning to gather back here in San Jose, California. Not related to the railroad work, but there are so many other things to study around the railroad still.
I'd like to mention one project that the three of us were involved in. It was called a film, Digging to Chinatown, and it's about the history of Highlandville, Chinatown in San Jose, which was built after the arson fire of Market Street, Chinatown, San Jose, which is the site of the Fairmont Hotel now. And Barb could talk about the archaeology that she's worked for 10 years on the Market Street, Chinatown. And I'm still continuing to work on the history of Highlandville, consulting with the new development there. And we're gonna have a history medallion, sort of a history park, which is called Highlandville Park inside the development. So we will commemorate the history and also the ongoing spirit of community of, you know, Japantown, Filipino community, and the Chinese as well. So, and Vietnamese. So, Barb, yeah.
Well, I first want to thank you, Judy, so much for these comments. And I want to second what you said, you know, that Phil Choi was hardly not a failure in any way. And in fact, he and many others opened the doors and created the spaces where many of us could be doing this work today. Phil was an incredible mentor to me, and Connie, as you have been. It's actually been 19 years now that we've been working together, which is amazing how quickly the time has flown. I first met Connie through Stanford's involvement in analysis of collections from the San Jose Chinatowns that Connie mentioned. And so my current work right now, I'm actually working on a book project related to the Chengdu Village project and the Railroad Worker project. You know, I don't have a particular timeline for that as books go, but it's something I've been working on. But really right now, a lot of my current research energy is focused on some really exciting work we're doing on the Stanford campus itself. So Leland Stanford was one of the big four who owned the Central Pacific Railroad, and he continued to build railroads throughout the US West after the transcontinental was completed. I should say finance and arrange for that, because of course he did not himself do the building. We already have established who did the actual work. But as part of that, you know, Leland Stanford and his family had very tight relationships with a lot of Chinese American business leaders and crafts workers. The Stanford University is on the Stanford family farm, the former farm. They did a lot of agricultural experiments there, and most of the workers on that farm were very talented agriculturalists, landscapers, and horticulturalists, Chinese people who worked very closely with the Stanford family. The Stanford family also owned land in Monterey, which was the site of one of the first large Chinese communities in the United States, the Point Alones fishing village. And so a lot of my recent efforts have been focused on working with our Stanford Heritage team to make sure that those sites are properly conserved and commemorated. We have done excavations at some of those sites, and we've been analyzing the artifacts from those. There are other sites that other worker housing locations that we haven't yet located that we hope to identify in the future. And in many ways, the work that we're doing on the Stanford campus is both the before and the after of the railroad. Point Alones, Chinatown, was founded in the early 1850s. Again, one of the first Chinese communities in the United States, large Chinese communities in the United States. And it's critically important in the history of Chinese America, a really important community. And then the worker housing at Stanford itself continued into the 1930s. And so after the railroad was completed, after the Stanfords made their money off of the profit from Chinese railroad workers, bought the land that the campus is today and developed it first as a farm and then a university. So it's been really exciting for me both to be continuing the work in San Jose that we've been doing for quite some time, but also then to be bracketing kind of, you know, my own institution's relationship to Chinese America. And we're really excited about the work we're doing.
Thank you. We have another question that's not quite related to the film, but maybe you guys can answer it. Lisa asked if you guys know any related research projects like this that focus on Chinese women coming to the US after World War II.
I don't know of any happening now, but I think it is a fascinating topic that deserves research. I know Sue Lee is out in the audience, and she was interested in this as well, that you know, the women that were here or in the United States early on created a network, a very powerful network, and I think they ran a lot of the show behind the scenes. And I think it would be a great story, a great research topic if someone out there can do it.
And the late Judy Young did a great deal of work on this too, and wrote a lot about it. And Unbound Feet was one of her works about Chinese women during and after World War II.
Yeah, I was going to mention Judy. If someone can maybe send a link to some of her work. But yeah, Judy Young has done a lot of work on Chinese women. Cool. I think my only question, we don't have any more questions coming in, so I can ask a question of my own and just be, you know, after working on this project altogether, could each of you share what is one thing you want everyone to learn, to take away from this work that you guys have done, and what can they go and share with their communities? And whoever wants to start. Barry, do you want to start?
Go ahead, Connie.
You start. Will you repeat the question?
Sorry. So my question is, so we as an education institution, are you working on this project? You know, what do you want people to take away from the project and the work that you've done that they can go and share with their friends and family? I think we've talked about quite a lot, that we can all do oral history, we can all listen, we can all record, and it's for a purpose. You know, who are we as a people? And I think that we can all do that. We can be vigilant about what's going on in our society, the racism, and we could keep studying the roots of it. And we can draw from our ancestors' stories of how we got where we are. Thank you, Connie.
Go ahead.
Sure. So it's a great question. And I think there's two things that I would say. I think one of them is that, you know, our history books are often written, and I'm using this term in a very gender specific way, about great men, and particularly white men, politicians, designers, entrepreneurs, you know, capitalists, you know, all this kind of stuff. I think that one thing that I would encourage people to take back to their communities is, no matter what you are thinking about historically, look for the workers and look for the communities, right? Look for who built and operated whatever is being studied, and look for the communities that they came from and that they supported through that labor. It transforms the way we think about US history, and really it transforms the way we think about global history. I think the other thing that I would add is that often we sometimes hear, oh, there's no records of that, there's no information about that group, oh, that's lost to history. Well, as the archaeologist in the room, I want to tell you, we have ways of finding it. That, you know, even if we don't know people's names, we can tell you about how they lived, the conditions of their daily life, how they navigated racism, how they survived oppression. We can recover a lot of information. And so if you are a historian or you are a student doing a school project and you feel like you're running into roadblocks, remember that there's a whole team of researchers out there whose whole mission is to try to unblock those gaps in the historical record and to fill it in with accurate factual information rather than stereotypes and misconceptions. So I know those are both very conceptual, but I hope that it's somehow helpful. Thanks.
Those are both really beautifully made statements. So my goal has been with filmmaking is to create empathy for whoever I'm making the film about, and not in an artificial way, but in a way that's just telling the truth. And I think that if we can all have empathy for one another and see each other as individuals and not just as monoliths of Chinese workers or Mexicans at the border or whatever label you want to use, the world will be a better place. So hopefully by telling these stories and sort of putting names and faces on the history, you know, these people that came over to work on the railroad were you know, they had brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and grandparents and children, and they weren't just automatons. These were people with personalities and lives that they left behind, and many of them lost their lives here building the railroad. So hopefully we can all think of each other as individuals going forward, and make the world a better place.
Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing that. I think it's very much agreed that we need to share these stories and share more. Not yet, especially like, yeah, we need to reject kind of that great man in history kind of thinking. And what are the stories of the people that, you know, our ancestors, share those so that we can better understand ourselves as well. So thank you. I think that's the only questions. We did have a question. I don't know if anyone can answer this about if we know, Connie, maybe you know a little bit more about like Chinese workers in the Caribbean.
No, I don't.
Okay, so we had some questions. Maybe that's something we can share later in a future program, but I really much enjoyed, I hadn't been able to watch the entire documentary before today, so it was great. I seen it in bits and pieces as well. It was great watching everything. It was also great to get further insights from Connie and Barre. So thank you so much. We're ending a little bit early, but that's okay. It looks like it's a beautiful Saturday afternoon, at least where Barry's at. So maybe we can all in Hawaii.
Yeah, so sorry, someone put in the comment to look up Dr. Evelyn Hugh DeHart at Brown University. So she's an expert on the Chinese in the Caribbean. I'm sure you can find some research that she's done. She's great.
Right. And awesome. We will be sending out a follow-up email with everyone with some resources to kind of comment more and share more insights into what we discussed today. And we appreciate everyone for staying on for the entire program.
Thank you too. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the audience, and thank you to CHSA Maggie and the volunteers behind the scenes for making it run so smoothly. It was a great afternoon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Bye.
Goodbye.